Doing this for again?
Podcasting and storytelling.
Nice.
So, my initial intention was to interview professors, which I'm doing, and just learn about the courses that they're in, what they teach. I heard that it's a type of schooling, podcasting. So I just wanted to.
It's a type of what?
Schooling.
Schooling.
Yeah, for some people, some kind of education that they do. So I wanted to learn from people.
Okay, so you're using podcasting as a way of exploring your interests.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Cool.
And the angle I wanted to thank you for letting me do this. First of all,
Sure.
this is so I was very surprised. And the angle I want to come at this first is what's your favorite book of all time?
My favorite is Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe.
Oh,
yeah, and I enjoy reading it. I enjoy teaching it. I've taught it at grade levels from middle school to college. And it's a book that every time I read, every time I go back to, I find something more. And it's very beautiful because the language is very simple in some ways. It's very straightforward, but it has just so many layers when you start digging into it that, it's thinking not just about the colonial context, but also about complex issues around gender and class and masculinity. So yeah, I really enjoy that book.
Yeah, there's so many interpretations to go about it. What's your preferred?
Well, I guess I have different interpretations of different parts of the book, but one of the parts that I've been working with, particularly right now, is around the image of Okonkwo's father in the book, who's presented as a happy man who enjoys playing music and having a good time and throwing parties. But because he hasn't achieved titles within the culture, he is called Agbala, which Okonkwo learns at a young age also means woman. And so in Okonkwo's mind, when he learns that and connects it with his shame that he holds for his father, he also develops this shame around anything he considers feminine or womanly, right? So he really latches onto masculinity. But within Igbo culture, gender is actually more flexible than it is within Western cultures, so that people are not necessarily tied to the gender they're assigned at birth. So one of the things I'm thinking about with his father is the idea that woman wasn't an insult with his father, but a description of his father's gender expression. And that it's only in Okonkwo's mind that gets twisted around his fear of failure. And that's how he locks on to this, he must be the most masculine man possible. So it's an error in his thinking, right?
Yes. Did this book bleed into the book that you're... do you mind sharing about the book? Or
about the book I'm working on?
Yes.
Sure. I do talk about this book in the scholarly book that I'm working on. I don't focus as much on this book because my interest in my research is on literature by and about sex and gender minorities, so women and LGBTQ folks in West Africa. So Chinua Achebe, his works don't directly fall into that, although as with I was just talking about with Things Fall Apart, we can do this kind of analysis of gender that's not cis-normative, right? But I focus more on books by women and queer folks.
Yes.
And that's really my interest with the research in the book. So I'm looking at West African literature from the 1950s, late 50s to the present, and looking at women who were writing and writing about and talking about gender. I look at some anthropological texts that are talking about
what does that mean?
Gender.
Anthropological.
So books by anthropologists. that are very interested in gender expression. So Ifeoma Diume's Male Daughters, Female Husbands is a book about this flexible gender within Igbo culture.
Yes.
So, so I look at a lot of different genres of books, not just novels.
Is this like a religious thing? Like the Igbo, they're more flexible?
It is in all aspects of the culture, so it's not just specifically religious. There are some religious forms of gender fluidity among the Igbo and other cultures. But it's not specifically that. It's also about status and inheritance and continuing family lines in some cases. In some cases, a person who is considered female at birth will go on to become very wealthy. And in becoming wealthy, she has the opportunity to become independent and take on other women as wives. And so by doing that, she can become what's called a female husband.
Wow.
Yeah, so some cases, it's just an economic, shift. So
Right.
it's not specifically religious. It's in kind of all aspects of society. There's these different ties.
So do women
just
get...
like gender is connected to everything within Western culture, right?
Right. So do women get more liberty in this culture compared to more conservative cultures?
Well, so first of all, the opportunities for women have been negatively impacted by the history of colonization, because the colonial powers did a lot of work to make Western gender norms the norms within everywhere that they colonized. So, however, comparably, we could say that, for example, women among the Igbo had the right to divorce before women in the West did. Right?
Wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah. Women among Igbo had the right to have personal property and own businesses before women in the West did. Right? So yes, but there's also been, colonization also has had some impact on those possibilities, because it, Britain came in and said the ideal arrangement of gender in society looks like the way we do it, right? Women stay home and men go to work, and you have a nuclear family, and that's the way, civilized
Right.
gender looks. So that did a lot of violence.
What got you into African literature?
I guess I was an undergraduate, and I read Things Fall Apart, and it was, I'd grown up just reading the American and British lit because that's what was available, and I hadn't read any post-colonial literature, any literature about colonization in other parts of the world, and I just fell in love with the book right away, and no matter what I did in life, I just kept coming back to Chinua Achebe and then reading more books by Nigerian authors and more books by West African authors.
Right.
So I made a hobby of it, and then by the time I knew that I was ready for my PhD, I knew what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to do African lit.
Yeah, did it like come as surprise that All Things Fall Apart when you read it?
It did, yeah, because if you've been indoctrinated in American and British literature, you've been reading that your whole life.
Yeah.
And I grew up a while ago. If you've been reading American and British lit your whole life, the representation of the other, right, scare quotes other,
Yeah.
is very negative and very one-dimensional. And when you read Things Fall Apart, it counters all of that, right? So reading it is sort of, for me at least, was this I don't know. I really liked the kind of paradigm shift that it brought to me in that moment. I was 18 or 19. It was like, whoa.
Yes.
Yeah.
So how is like African literature kind of unique from English, American, Russian, like from all these literatures?
Well, I think that American and British lit often provide us with this narrative arc where it's sort of the traditional Bildungsroman where you have a character who has a problem, and then there's some complications and there's a crisis, and then everything gets resolved. But the arc of the story, or the way the stories are told, it all sort of leads to this ending where there is a resolution, a happy resolution or a sad resolution. Somebody dies maybe in a tragedy, but the resolution at the end is in some way satisfying, given the whole narrative. And often these sorts of stories about, especially ones that are the happily ever after stories, and then everything worked out and it was happily ever after, lead us over time to feel like that's the way adversity works, right? We face, there's something happens, there's adversity, we face it, we conquer it, and then life goes on and everything is always better. Yes. Right? It's that progress narrative. So in African lit and other forms of lit, you don't get that neat, tidy narrative arc. Sometimes the end of the book, like things fall apart, is very ominous, right? Because we know at the end that we're now facing the colonizer, and things are going to fall apart, right? That's the book.
Yeah.
But in some cases, the endings can be very disturbing. In some cases, it's like you have narratives where there's sort of resolution, or it feels like resolution, and then things get kind of worse, or there's cyclical storytelling, right? So the narrative pattern is not always what you get in Western lit. In some cases, like Dilemma of a Ghost by Ama Ata Aidu, the ending of the story is intentionally left with this open question or dilemma. And then the purpose of that is for the audience to go out, into their regular lives and continue the conversation and work out the dilemma, and thus establish the morals of the story and the community. So they have different kinds of functions.
Right. I heard that you had a big traveling experience in your life.
So when I was young, my family was on Guam, and then we were in Athens, Greece, and then we were on Guam again.
Oh,
so by the time my dad was Air Force, so by the time now, even though Guam is a colony of the United States, a territory, I didn't have a really strong concept of the United States as the nation I was from.
Wow, you were living in these places?
Yeah. I kind of thought I was Greek at first, and then I thought I was Guamanian, and then I just wasn't really sure what was going on. But then my family came back. I was still kind of young when we got back, but we settled in El Paso, Texas, which is right on the U.S.-Mexico border.
Right.
So I grew up 5 minutes from the border.
Wow.
Which I have always loved. It's a beautiful place to grow up.
Did that have a effect on your writing experience? Traveling to these places, growing up in different. Do you think it did, or?
I think so. One of the problems I had with reading American and British lit as a kid is. You read these stories that are primarily set on either in England or the East Coast of the United States, right? Yeah. With the exception of some regional writers, but there's a lot of sort of East Coast writing. And the kinds of things that were happening in those works weren't things that were part of my world at all, either when we were traveling abroad or living in El Paso. I mean, just things as simple as snow and going out and playing in the snow and sledding and all of that stuff. Like,
Yes.
El Paso is a desert. Guam is an island. Greece is pretty arid. None of those places had the kind of scenery or kind of like winter cultures that you get in these like canonical literature. But also, I think, just meeting people from different cultures, growing up hearing many languages all the time, was also, I think, an important factor in making me open or interested in global literature. Also, if you've circled the globe 4 times by the time you're 8, you're pretty sure it's global. Like, you get right? So, the idea that there is sort of a globality to the world was pretty imprinted on me when I was young.
What was, most prominent in your recollection, like, from your traveling experiences?
Well, I was a kid. I can remember sitting on the steps of the Parthenon thinking this is very boring.
Really?
Right?
Oh, wow.
And today I would kill to be able to go back. I mean, I will go back, but it's like, silly kid. And on Guam, I just remember swimming in the ocean and climbing coconut trees and racing with the neighborhood kids to see who could husk a coconut the fastest with a butter knife. That was just a thing we did.
Wow.
Yeah. It was fun.
Were you into literature at that time, or it was more...
I was actually a late reader. I didn't learn to read until 2nd or 3rd grade, which in Texas is pretty late. Yeah. So I didn't get to be a reader until I actually learned to read. And then after that, I just took off with it. I had a librarian taught me how to read because the rest of my class had already learned to read. So the librarian brought me aside and started teaching me to read. And once I picked it up, I took off with it. And so then, I would always go find the library at every school I went to.
Yes. Was it limited in these other countries, the books?
I think the education was just different. In Greece, we were at an American school, but, when you're in Athens, I guess one of the interesting things about wanting to know how to read when you're in a country that doesn't use the same alphabet is the signs around you don't have, like, even if you're learning individual letters, the signs around you don't have those letters.
Yes.
So I think that if there was some to do with environment, some to do with the schooling. They didn't emphasize reading as early. And I'm trying to think when we were on Guam. It wasn't an emphasis of what we were doing there.
What kind of impact did reading have in your life?
I was very introverted as a kid, and so I used books to escape to my imagination. I would read. I liked reading books, animal books and fantasy books and science fiction books and just everything I could get my hands on. I remember reading Stephen Hawking's, and I would read all genres.
Yeah.
Not even just fiction, but I remember reading Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time about physics when I was in high school. And even though, after reading it, I didn't want to be a physicist, it was a really challenging book, and it made me feel it boosted my confidence in myself as somebody who could do well in school, because I hadn't always up until that point. I think also I learned, I used books to try and figure out how to communicate with people because I was so introverted, and the books would you can see how conversations go on the page and sort
Right.
of be like, that's how that works. Okay.
Well, like narrative, like
Yeah,
specific.
sort of like social skills.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I would do the same thing. I would literally like every now and then, like I'm reading a novel, and then like I'll see like I don't know, like a sentence, and it just sounded nice. Like they use some kind of analogy or technique. I literally just try and like steal it and just like say it in like every day.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Books are great for that.
what book do you think? Well, I guess All Things Fall Apart, but like out of like what else has a big impact in this course? Like in the course?
From the books from the course?
Yeah, like the one that we're taking.
Okay, so well, of course, things fall apart.
Yeah.
I think. Oh, and then. I'm like, I like them all. I really like. I do like Dilemma of a Ghost. I can't choose between all of them.
Oh,
But
yes.
we're about to start Dog Eaters, which I don't know if it's so influential, but it's a fun book. Well, I say it's a fun book, but it has some very painful things happening in it. But it also has kind of a biting sort of humor. But in terms of teaching, I like teaching that particular book because of its queerness, which we'll sort of see as we read.
Right.
Yeah.
So starting like with the English patient, for instance, like what kind of things can we learn from that? Like,
I think that people so this is the thing we talked about in class. Like, is this a love story, right?
Yeah.
I think that people read The English Patient and if your first time through it really feels like a love story, and like maybe love is, or the impossibility of love or something like that is what we take from it. But I think there's this deeper thing going on about the modern, the postmodern, and the post-colonial. And that is to say that, there are these, within the book, there are these very modernist ideologies, especially Almasi is very, about this grand narrative of history. And then the text itself is simultaneously like trying to break down those narratives in a very postmodern way. So it's like there's this conflict within the structure of the book between the modern and the postmodern. But that never really makes sense until Kip has that, explosive moment
with Hiroshima.
Yeah. And sees everything, sees the dynamics for what they are. And when we see that moment, I think what it reveals to us is how, this tension between the modern and the postmodern makes more sense and looks a whole lot different from this perspective of the post-colonial, right? And I think that's what's important, or that's, for me right now, that's what's important about The English Patient.
No, I agree. Like, I definitely see how that, like, there was a whole shift after that. And, like, they didn't want to, they hated being part of nations.
And if you go back and read it again after that moment, like now we see how it all came together, and you go back and read it again, you start to see all of those things working out more. Sometimes you see more often, almost always, you see more in the second reading, right? Because now it's like, okay, I see how this is all leading up to this. Right. Like watching a film a second time, right?
Yes, yeah. It's, like, I think I heard that it was the best book in, like, during the World War II era for, like, a decade.
Well, it was published in the 90s, so well after, but it was a Booker Prize winner, and then it was also... was it a Gold Booker? It's not a book. It wasn't the Booker of Bookers, but yeah, it was given. So the Booker is an annual prize, and then they also, for the 50th anniversary, gave like each decade got its own Booker. So it won basically twice. So it's a very well awarded book, and of course it was made into a film.
And it's a true story too.
Not a true story, but woven from threads of true stories. So Amasi, the English patient character, was a real person, except he didn't, end up getting burned from falling out of a plane.
Oh, really?
Yeah, really.
Oh, I was. Oh.
I know it's. If I remember correctly, the actual Almasi, who was a spy during Hungarian spy during World War II, went on to live a complete life, and so it's interesting that Ondaatje takes this, makes the character out of this man who didn't end up the way he does in the novel. Like, he makes this is like the novel conflicts with history in that way too, which is kind of weird and cool.
Yes. I want to take a segue to like more of your teaching.
Sure.
I saw that you teach a class on animals and environment and global literature.
I do.
So what's this about then?
So that is about it's about animals and the environment. The book is the class teaches global literature from an eco-critical and zoocritical lens.
I don't know what that means.
Yeah, so eco-critical is from an environmentalist lens, right? So we're thinking about the significance of the environment within these books. And zoocritical is animals, like the significance of animals. And we're doing it from a global perspective. We have a lot of concern, or we're used to talking about a lot of concern for the environment within a U.S. context, but without thinking we're not so much used to thinking globally.
Yes.
So all of these novels these novels and short stories that we read in the class, take those issues and look at them from, around the world. So, for example, one of the books we read is Animals, People by Indra Sinha, which is a novel about the Bhopal chemical disaster in India. So in India in the 1980s, Union Carbide, which is an American company and had a factory in India, their factory in India had a massive chemical leak that killed thousands of people and blinded and maimed many more. It also poisoned the area of the community and left the people around there with just generations of health problems that came from the damage that the company did to the environment. And so Animal is one of the is the main character. He calls himself Animal.
Oh, okay.
And he calls himself Animal because as a result of the chemical disaster, his spine is twisted and he can't stand up right on his back legs. He has to go everywhere on four limbs, right, like an animal. So he calls himself Animal. So the story is from his perspective, and it's after the disaster. And he's working with a group of activists and environmentalists who want to, get compensation from Union Carbide for what they've done.
Yes.
So that novel, that's an example of one. Another one we read is Oil on Water, which is about the petroleum industry in the Niger Delta region and the damage that oil extraction has done to the communities there.
Huh.
Yeah.
So animals tie in, like it's more of a metaphor.
So there's some there's some literal discussion of animals. So towards the end of the course, we're also thinking about what are the rights and how do we think about animals in relation to people and our rights to the environment, our need to protect, for example, and conserve spaces for endangered species versus our need to conserve spaces for endangered populations of humans. For example, we read a novel called The Hungry Tide about a region called the Sundarbans in India where the land has been conserved for tigers who are endangered, but that land is also home to indigenous peoples whose lives are also endangered by poverty and climate change, right?
The tigers don't have any kind of...
The tigers, no, there's no fence or barrier between the tigers and the communities, and the people are not legally allowed to defend themselves from the tigers or kill the tigers because the tigers are protected, right? So it's a situation where the international community has got behind the protection of the tigers, but left these vulnerable people, as a result, even more vulnerable and isolated at a time when, like, climate change, sea level rising, and all of that is also shrinking the amount of land they have to live on and make a livelihood on. So we're also thinking about animals literally, not just metaphorically too,
Yes.
right?
What's your most fulfilling class, like, that you teach? I mean, I bet you like all of them, but like, what's your
I love all of them. I really enjoy teaching animals and the environment and literature. I also like teaching decolonizing sex and gender. And that probably is, I think, the most fun I have with all of my classes. So that one is a course where we're looking at LGBTQ rights and representation in literature and film and podcasting globally. Well, a podcast we have. But so we're, again, looking at literature from around the world that's written about the queer experience.
Yes.
And within these various contexts, including post-colonial contexts, colonial, post-colonial contexts, and within the context of globalization. So we read, for example, Walking with Shadows, which is a novel published in Nigeria. In Nigeria, homosexuality is illegal, and it's also illegal for people to associate with other people in order to advance gay rights. So basically, it's illegal for LGBTQ people to associate in Nigeria.
Oh, wow.
So it's very, very extremely prohibitive. The punishment, I think, is 14 years in jail.
Wow.
Yes.
If like what, like how would they
for associating?
Just like being together and boyfriend, boyfriend,
yes.
and girlfriend,
yeah. So yeah, wow. It's extremely punitive. It's one of the most punitive in the world. The novel we read, Walking with Shadows, is set a little bit before the passage of that most recent anti-homosexuality law in Nigeria, but still, while homosexuality is illegal. And it's about a man who's been living in the closet, trying to live a heterosexual life, and he lives in Nigeria and has his family's there. He gets outed by someone who calls people he knows on the phone and says that he's a homosexual. And so that's the start of the novel, is he's been outed and he has to come to terms, he has to deal with all of the fallout, he has to rethink about who he is and, if he really can choose heterosexuality. So yeah, it's an really interesting book. It was published in Nigeria by a small press, and then shortly after, the author had to flee the country because of the law. Yeah, and so he lives in exile now. So
what was the biggest stressor? Like, was it like social norms or expressing yourself authentically, or
for him?
Yeah.
I think it was just after he published the book, he was out, he was well known, he had published some other short stories online too, so there was, no way he could, unring that bell, so to speak. He had outed himself through the work he was doing. And even if he hadn't outed himself, even if he had claimed he was heterosexual, but he was writing this literature about homosexuality, he still would have been, a target. So, yeah, it's just self-preservation.
Oh, wow. So, shoot, I just had a... So has there yet been a book where they kind of describe the like the feelings of someone trying to express themselves authentically through gender or sexuality?
I think I think many books do, and I think a lot of books try. I think many books do. I don't think there's one authentic, way of expressing oneself. Even for an individual person, I think how we authentically express ourselves is going to shift from day to day and context to context. But it's in these books. In this literature, various authors are sort of not only grappling to describe their own experience, but also to explain that experience to the world. So there's some memoirs by Hijra women in South Asia. Hijra is, we would call a transgender woman, so assigned male at birth, but later transitioned to female. And Hijra women have a particular role within the South Asian community, not always positive. They are extremely marginalized. But so these memoirs that there's one called "The Truth About Me" by Revathi, and the other is Lakshmi Narayan, is Me Lakshmi Me Hijra, yeah. And each of those books both tell the experience or describe the experience of coming to terms with being Hijra, and then what they went through their transition and post-transition. But they're describing their experience, but also at the same time trying to get the reader to accept that this and recognize that this is a valid experience, right? So there's also persuasion involved in these books.
Right.
For example, in The Truth About Me, Revathi talks about the difficulties she had with something as simple as getting her license in India, because all of her birth documentation had the wrong gender and name on it, and when she went to get her license, she encountered all of these kinds of barriers and stigmas, right? And had to go through just a lot to get there. So she uses that particular narrative to say to the reader, why do we make this so difficult? I'm just trying to be a good citizen, right? And do what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to show that I have a license and I know how to drive, and therefore I'm being safe. So I'm trying to be good. Why should we make this more difficult for me? So it's that sort of persuasion, like, what's the purpose of these barriers? I'm just a good person trying to follow the rules of a civilized society.
And all these novels that you teach in this class, it seems like it's mostly outside of the U.S.
Oh, yeah. I don't teach British or American literature, except, I should say, I teach sometimes literature by indigenous people and minoritized people from Britain and England. So I teach a class on border literature. I'm teaching that this semester. And we teach, so in that class, I do teach writers from the U.S. I teach Chicano writers from the U.S. Southwest, and then within that book, we also draw in stories from other borders around the world in order to, move beyond just thinking about the U.S. context. But sometimes I'll teach indigenous writers. I've taught Tommy Orange there. But primarily I do try and, most of the literature I teach and study is outside the U.S. and Britain.
That's interesting, because you kind of get like a perspective, like the life of someone kind of like going through expressing themselves authentically, like outside of America. So you kind of get like a whole different perspective. So the students probably see it as like, oh wow, this is how people may express themselves this way in this country.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope that people get the chance to, let the literature take them, to this other context, take them to this other place, as much as is possible. Have the same experience as someone else. I mean, we can never fully know what it is to be someone else, but literature takes us as close as we can get, I think. And through that to think about not only like what's it like to go through these different experiences and have these different struggles in different cultures and places around the world, but also make connections to their own experiences and thinking about not only how they can empathize or relate, but also how they can use these stories to break down any biases they might have because we live in a biased society, right?
Yes.
So it's also like about breaking down some barriers, hopefully.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty healing. At least God of Small Things, to me personally, was pretty healing. I guess from my own experiences, like, in life. But,
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But, what was the other question? Oh, what book are you currently reading, by the way? I just want to know.
Oh, what book am I currently reading?
Or, like, last read.
I'm reading all of the books for all of my classes.
Really?
I reread them every semester. I enjoy doing that. I just put something, Signs Preceding the End of the World, I just put on my to-read list, which is a novel by a Mexican author. This is the translated. My Spanish is not quite good enough to read the original. But it looks to be pretty interesting. And then also I'm in a book club on the weekends. It's a community book club, and we read, it's a queer community book club, and we're reading a graphic novel by Maya Kobabe called Genderqueer, which is a very interesting book because it's one of the books that people around the U.S. have been trying to get out of school and public libraries. It's one of the top banned books of this year.
Wow, why?
Because it's about gender. It's about gender beyond cis-normative frame. It's about gender beyond a binary. It's about a person who talks very explicitly about he uses ERM pronouns, neopronouns. Right.
I'm not sure.
I use he, him, his.
Yeah.
Right. When people refer to me, I say refer to me as he. And some people use she, her, hers. Some people use they, them, theirs. And then some people use pronouns that are called neopronouns, which are not they're like new pronouns is what the prefix means, but they're actually not really all that new. They're pronouns from past ages, but they're pronouns that are non-binary. So a person who doesn't feel male or female, but has some other kind of relationship to gender. So the author uses em air. So like you would say, E wrote a book.
Yeah. Yes.
The book was by M, right?
Right.
Yeah. So we're reading that book, and so all of those, the sexual themes, the gender themes, and also the pronouns, has got some folks upset around the country, and they've been trying to get the book out of libraries.
How do they have that power to do that?
They do not.
Oh, word.
But they don't, and they shouldn't. But but in reality, they can make a fuss. They can cause libraries to take books off the shelf temporarily, or put books in a place so they have to be requested, and all of that is censorship, right? Censorship should not be happening anywhere in our libraries ever. right?
Yeah, like literally, yeah.
But the uproar can cause problems. Even if a librarian is like, oh, I'm not really, trying to avoid controversy. If they have to take the book off the shelf, even for a day, that's censorship, right?
Yeah.
So this is one of the books that nationally that has been targeted for that kind of trend.
But how does this like affect their lives? Like this is just like.
Yeah, right. If you don't like a book, don't read it.
Yeah.
Skip that section in the library. I'm okay with that.
But like, is there like a certain demographic of people? Like, I'm guessing it could be a conservative group of people, or.
I think it has come from the conservative. Yeah, it's definitely more of a conservative trend, and it's it's part of. They say it's it's part of the culture wars currently, but I think that it's been a way for conservative politicians and people running in local offices, like running for county, city offices for those.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. School board, right?
Yeah,
running for them to build a platform that can get people upset and therefore out to the polls.
Oh, jeez.
Right? Yeah.
So there's a book club, and this is the current book
This is the current book we're reading, yeah. And I just do that on the weekends. It's fun.
So what is it? It's like a social gathering. You guys come together, talk about.
We Zoom. So yeah, which is nice because we have people from anywhere can join us, and one of our regular members is in Germany, and they're German, and we have another member in California. Yeah, so we have a pretty good reach.
And they're all queer members in the group, or?
You don't have to be queer to be a member of the group. Some people consider themselves queer. Some people consider themselves questioning. Some people are allies. So, yeah, it's just...
What's an ally?
An ally is somebody who maybe doesn't identify as being within the LGBTQ community, in this case, but they want to... support LGBTQ people and causes and issues, and maybe in order to do that they want to learn more first, and so they do something like join a book club where they can learn more and thus be a better ally and supporter and advocate, right?
What do you get out of the book club?
It's a good way to spend my Saturday morning while I'm drinking my coffee.
Yeah, that's right.
And I've made some good friends through doing the book club. So yeah, it's I'm pretty happy to get together with people and talk about books just about any time. So it's just pleasant.
Yeah. I have a question on like a quote I heard. I just like asking people that are good at literature to see what their point of view is on it. The quote is, "Reading is better than experiencing." That's like literally the whole quote.
Reading is better than experiencing.
Yeah. What does that like? What does that even mean?
That's interesting.
I guess an example.
I think that when you're reading something, perhaps, there's this meta aspect to it where you're sort of standing above the experience, right?
Yes.
You can always fall into the experience and let the text take you away, but you can also have this sort of above experience where you can both experience and reflect on it simultaneously, maybe, possibly. But I also think, and I always say, that experience exceeds our ability to capture it in language.
Okay, yes.
Right?
Yes.
We can't reproduce an experience with all, down to the moment, down to the, what it was to be me in that moment experiencing that thing, with all of the tools of figurative language that we have, all of the literary techniques, we can't fully reproduce the experience of being a person in a moment going through something, right?
Right.
experience is always much bigger than language. So in that sense, I think I would not disagree, but I would sort of put like a footnote on that, you know, like, sure, you know, reading can be better than experiencing, but experience always exceeds our ability to capture it in language. So if we're just reading, we're also missing things, which I hate to admit because I love literature, but it's true.
Would you consider literature like a form of like entertainment, or?
Sure. It's entertainment, it's art, it's a way of learning, it's also a way of thinking about and philosophizing about, you know, what it means to be human, right? So it's all of those things.
And you consider like a, would you consider it like a powerful, I don't know how to explain this, like best learning process, because your data to, like the amount of data that you take in is quicker than suppose like a video or something like that?
I think that probably depends on the person.
That's a good point.
Yeah. And yeah, I would just have to say that that's really dependent on the person. I think it can be a very powerful way of learning, especially not just reading, like, you know, facts, you know, text. But when we bring in the literary language and techniques to talk about something, you know, say to write historical biography, right? Where we're not just listing facts, but we're really trying to make the reader understand what it was to be there in that moment. I think that can be a very much more powerful learning experience than reading a textbook, right?
Yes.
So yeah, I think there's.
Have you ever had those books where they kind of, sorry,
Running Out of Power?
Yeah. But have you ever had a book that was like dangerous to read? And what I mean by that is like you read it and then it was also like it actually had like a bad impact on you.
I've read some books that some people think are dangerous.
Where you're like, I wish I just never even.
Well, I read some Stephen King novels that gave me nightmares for a while, but no, I mean, I don't think I've ever. I mean, I've read a lot of books that people consider "quote unquote" dangerous. The Satanic Verses is one of my favorite books.
Really? Wait, wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, so this book is by Salman Rushdie, who is so. The book is about many things. On one layer, it's about the experience of being an immigrant in London, and in another way, another aspect. It's about how religious ideas come into the world and what we do with them when they do. But the book has a narrative thread within it that many felt was blasphemous, essentially, or offensive to the Muslim to Islam, to Muslims, and because of the way it represents a story that's like the story of the Prophet Muhammad. Because of this particular thread within the story, the Ayatollah, issued a fatwa against Salman Rushdie that any devout Muslim should kill him if they have the opportunity.
Wow.
Yes, this was in the 1980s.
So what was it like? Why would he want to write this book? Like, what was it?
So his family is, he's an extremely good writer, but some of the ideas or some of his desire to write the book came from having grown up in a Muslim family that was non-practicing. So culturally, they had this Muslim heritage, but the family was very secular. They didn't really practice. But his father was very interested in the history of Islam and the Quran, and so he had this. This was part of his family. This kind of cultural connection. But he also has, for a long time, had an interest in thinking about power and how power is used and abused, and so that's also in there. So this is a book that, people consider dangerous, but I read it, I teach it. I think the essential question of the book is two-part. One, how do new ideas come into the world, including new ideas about faith and religion and why we're here and all of those big questions. And then two, what do we do with them, with the new ideas when we have them, right? And those are pretty big questions and really important questions.
Is there a religion? Because I know there's a lot of tension between religion and like LGBTQ. I mean, in some religions, at least.
Yeah.
Is there a religion where it's like it seems they have a better thought process on it, or more inclusive or open?
There are, within all of the major religions of the world, so Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Islam. Wait, did I say Islam? Islam. Within these major religions, there are, within all of them, there are branches that are LGBTQ accepting and affirming. So, yes. There are also indigenous belief systems, including religion, that make space for people that we would consider LGBTQ from our cultural framework. So, yeah, I mean, across the board, sure.
Yes.
There are branches and sects that do.
Right.
And then there are these very powerful elements and branches that are not accepting.
Yeah, probably shouldn't generalize .
Yeah, I mean, we should always be wary of generalizing anything, because once we do, we're inevitably wrong.
Yes. One more question. What book do you recommend I read and why to understand gender? To understand gender more, gender studies more.
Do you read fiction or nonfiction more?
Nonfiction.
Nonfiction, okay. And are you... I'm trying to think of a good one. Okay. This is one I don't teach in my class, but it's called Gender Outlaws. And it is by... There's a couple of them. I need to find the right one. It's an anthology, which makes it pretty good. It's by Kate Bornstein and S. Bear Bergman. And it's a collection of short stories, essays, poetry, comic art, all kinds of different genres about gender expression beyond a binary. And it's just a really good book, and it's very edgy. So it's
in what way edgy?
So it's not. They're first of all they're throughout the book they're thinking beyond a binary, but they're also thinking in some ways very explicitly about bodies and what it means to be embodied and to have bodies that desire other bodies, right?
Yes.
And how we deal with that and how that's received within society. So it's done all in very personal ways, because the voices are of people who who are experiencing this themselves.
Yes.
So it's also very I think, edgy in terms of the different kinds of formats and genres of writing. There's a lot of sort of playing around with essay and poetry and all of these different things.
This is a relatively new book, or?
It is. It's from the it's 2010. Yeah. So.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, for real. Yeah. Like, I actually learned a lot.
You're welcome.
I'm just gonna pause this.